Podcasting from a secret location deep inside the political colossus. This is Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance.
Part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Let me tell you, I'm a really smart guy.
What's your name again? John Miller. And you work with Canada? Yes, that's correct.
Oh my God, they've got a madman on their hands.
We will have no truce nor parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
We've come to a turning point, a moment for hard decisions. If not us, who? And if not now, when?
It's 11:59 at Radio Free America, and this is Uncle Sam with music and the truth until dawn. Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the walls. The chair is against the walls.
This is Radio Free GOP with your host, Mike Murphy.
Is Donald Trump trying to Trump-angulate on immigration his key issue? Or has he just become a boring politician? We're talk that and an interview with the grown-up's grown-up, my friend, Ambassador Robert Zoellick. It's all here on Radio Free GOP. Start the music.
He used to have a big career, but now he's had enough. Podcasting's like therapy. His shrink says it's great stuff. Radio Free GOP.
Donald Trump, you are boring me. Who would have thought it? The orange menace, the tornado of political turbulence, suddenly is becoming just another flip-flopping, boring politician. Pretty predictable. Donald dug a deep trench in the primary of all his dog whistles on immigration. They put the indelible stain of racism on his campaign, and now that he is, unfortunately, the nominee, he's seeing polls that say he's dead on arrival politically. He's offended all the important swing voters you can, college-educated women, Latinos, other immigrants, you name it, he's ticked them off. So what's master salesman Donald Trump trying to do? Reinvent himself yet again. He's doing what every slippery salesman does in a corner, change the topic and try to remove the fear. This is leading to a new improved immigration plan, point 3. Now, we know there is no immigration plan because Trump doesn't believe in anything other than closing the sale. So the tactics of the primary Trump is finding are failing him in the general election. So with the ultimate pinnacle of cynicism that marks everything he does, he's flip-flopping to a plan that sounds just like, irony alert, Jeb Bush's, some sort of path to legal status. Now, we don't really know what the plan is because, again, Trump hates details. That would pin him down. Trump does what I call the big pot of stew style of politics, which is he describes what's in the stew depending on the audience. When he's got a flame-throwing audience, he holds up the Tabasco bottle, puts on a welder's mask and say, "This is the hottest stew ever. It'll burn your face off. You better eat it with a fire extinguisher." And they applaud. But when he's with another audience that doesn't want to burn their face off, he holds up a nice, harmless, plump red tomato and says, "Boy, this stew is so healthy and delicious." Plop, in goes the tomato into the boiling cauldron. You never know what's in the stew. You just hear promises calibrated to appeal to whatever you're looking for. It is normally known as the short con, and Donald Trump is at least accomplished in that. The problem is he's heading for one of the worst vices you can be caught in politics. You need a base to win. Now, treating the base voter like a swing voter is a mistake because the base is never enough to win by itself, and base voters have a high pain tolerance to vote for their team even when they're a bit disappointed. The problem is Trump's base is obsessed with immigration. Of all the issues to fold like a chair on, it will be the hardest. So the whole chattering chorus of Ann Coulters and the like, the whole industry of howling protest about immigration are going to feel betrayed. Love can turn into hate. And that grind on the Donald, plus the fact that he's dug such a deep hole with swing voters, Latinos, and other voters through his earlier rhetoric, means it's going to be very hard to get out of. The more successful the Orange Menace is at convincing these voters he's offended that he's not that offensive, and my guess is because he has such little credibility, he will not be very effective. But the better he does, if you give him the benefit of the doubt, at least tactically, among that vote, the worse he'll do among the voters who brung him to the dance. He can't please both, so he's stuck. What'll happen? What always happens with Trump. He'll try it for a while, he'll get frustrated, and then he'll try something new. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, they're having increasingly interesting leaked meetings with people that are very much a talisman of the fringe part of American politics. Pat Caddell, a longtime Democratic pollster who's not really a Democrat anymore, was at one time a brilliant strategist, very much involved in the George McGovern campaigns and the upset wins in the 70s in the Democratic primary. But he's become pretty much a crank, and he's hooked up, of course, with Steve Bannon, the nominal This Week head of Trump's campaign, whose resume is basically the howling website Breitbart News. What a combo those guys are. But I guarantee you they will have a populist revolt plan waiting in the wings when Trump does not get instant gratification for this new immigration 3, 4, 5.0 wiggling that he's doing now. You never win campaigns by wiggling around. You just alienate everybody that way. And because Trump is a feedback loop looking to the polls every day, the media polls, to find some sort of validation, he is bound to be disappointed. As the pain rises, as the anti-immigration right that elected him in the primary starts to howl betrayal, and over time, plenty of them will, if he keeps doing this, he'll abandon this tactic. And then the story narrative will be, yep, we can't trust Trump. He doesn't believe in anything. Even worse, look, another flip-flopping politician. The worst thing, the kryptonite for an anti-politician like Trump to wear around his neck. Desperate, broken, and still behind in the polls, Trump will then, I believe, turn to the Bannon church of total crazy outrage, and we'll be hearing all about Vince Foster murder plots, French metric systems, and God knows what else, just in time for the debates. I still haven't given up some of my suspicions that Trump may just crack and get out of the race. But if not, the debates are going to be both humorously and heartbreakingly the crescendo of this madhouse, this banana republic, this disgrace of a Republican campaign. On that note, I had a sad moment today. I was reading my email, and I got an email from Katrina Peterson. Now, I don't know Katrina Peterson, and the email was not a personal one. It was a mass email from the direct response team at the RNC, who I believe is managing some of the direct response fundraising, low-dollar fundraising, send $10 fundraising, for the joint fundraising committee between the Trump for President Committee and the RNC. You have seen her, though, on television. She's the lady with the necklace made out of spent shell casings. Now, I'm not a gun squish. I believe in background checks, but I've been around a lot of firearms in my day. Everything from fully automatic down to pistols. I know my way around a gun. I'm happy to. But this fetishization where you'd wear a necklace made out of spent cartridges while spewing, in her case, complete inane insanity on television as a spokesperson for the campaign, to me, is one of the many markers of the decline of the Trump campaign into a sick parody. To have the Republican National Committee, an organization that has standing and history in our country, sign off on an email package from a nutcase, a lunatic like Katrina Pearson, for the first time in decades, made me feel a little sad to be a Republican. All I can say is we're going to clean this mess up, and we're going to use very strong solvents, because the stain on the party gets a little worse every day. That's why we have a Republican resistance, and that's why I'm hoping more Republicans here, 70 days out, when it counts, blow the whistle on the short con and the carnival that is the Donald Trump for President campaign. Okay, let's pay some bills.
It's Resistance Podcasting, Radio Free GOP.
Okay, it's bill paying time here, and I'm happy to say we have some new advertisers coming on board. We're going to start in a week or two with them. They have required that I actually test their products before I hawk them. Now, I tried to explain I'm a political consultant. Let's not let that ethical thing get in the way. But they insisted, and good for them they did. So I went out and bought a fire extinguisher today as I burned down my kitchen trying to actually cook to test one well-known meal service. And I'm listening to a couple of interesting courses online. More details next week or the week after when we start up with some of these great new advertisers. That said, we remain indebted to our flagship initial advertiser, the great guys at the Private Equity Fundcast. Now, the Private Equity Fundcast is a weekly podcast hosted by Jim Milbury and Devin Matthews. They're partners in a Chicago-based private equity firm. Devin and Jim have spent the better part of the last 15 years buying and managing mid-market technology companies. These guys know what they're talking about. The Funcast draws from their collective experiences to pull back the veil on the secret world of private equity, much like we do here about politics on Radio Free GOP. Now, they talk about everything, from the 7 deadly sins of private equity to the good, the bad, and the ugly of board meetings. So if you're a founder or owner of a business, if you work in management perhaps for a private equity-backed company, provide services to private companies as an investment banker, a lawyer, an accountant, or like me, you just like to geek out on private equity, then you should subscribe to the Private Equity Funcast on iTunes or Google Play. Again, that's the Private Equity Funcast on iTunes or Google Play. Now, we're also partially sponsored, because they're too cheap to pay the whole bill, by our friends at Ricochet.com, the smartest and most civil center-right community on the web. No trolls, they guarantee it. You can become a member, and then your voice can be heard as you post and enter discussions, and get access to all kinds of great podcasts they produce. They also carry our podcast, Radio Free GOP. Now, the thing costs $5 a month, but in the special Platinum Club here, if you mention you're a Radio Free GOP listener, you get your first month free. That's right. You owe me $5. See, you're already ahead. All you got to do is sign up at ricochet.com/join. That's ricochet.com/join. And a note to my non-Republican friends, look over the fence. Check it out. Go in for a few months and see. You might find an interesting point of view, challenge your own thinking. Why not? It's only $5. And again, if you're a Radio Free GOP listener, the first month is free. And finally, we have our merch on the web. It is almost Labor Day and time to spruce up the old wardrobe. You may need some formal things for the fall. Why not the navy blue, elegant Radio Free GOP t-shirt? Or for those hang-around-the-house weekends, the white t-shirt. Both feature our logo, the Republican elephant upside down in distress, and both are American-made by craftsmen, not Chinese slave labor. They will last a long time. Join the Republican resistance with one of our cool t-shirts. Just go to radiofreegop.com, get yours today, and while you're there, we have a little button with the Amazon.com logo. Click that, and we get our beak wet. We get a taste. We get dusted off every time you buy something on Amazon. That helps pay the bills around here, which are mounting. We have yes men, we have henchmen, we have everything, and they all cost. Finally, we have a PayPal button. You can press that and make a small donation too. We appreciate it. All your support is much welcomed. Finally, thank you for the great reviews on iTunes. Keep posting them. Those tell the Apple algorithm to share the podcast with more people, and the Republican resistance will grow. We're really doing well in the iTunes ratings, and that is because of you. I am very grateful. And now, time to get back to work.
Fight for sanity in this crazy year on Radio Free GOP.
You know, every time the Orange Menace goes off on his tired, patented rant about trade, it's always the same cartoonish story. Foolish, bumbling American trade negotiators are outwitted by the Chinese, blah, blah, blah. You know, it dawns on me the only thing Trump has really done is inherited money, gambled with debt that he often didn't repay on real estate, flipped a few parking lots, put his name on a few gold-plated condos, and fired Gilbert Gottfried on television. Yet he's going to lecture us on complicated international trade agreements that I don't think he's ever read, let alone really understands. So I thought it would be a good idea here on the podcast to do a little grown-up check on trade policy and on Trump in general. And I knew exactly who to call, my friend Robert Zoellick. Now, Bob has served at the highest levels with great distinction in our government in Republican administrations. He's worked closely. He was at the right hand of Jim Baker at State. He's been our trade negotiator. He's served as president of the World Bank. He knows his stuff at the highest level. And he's done something that Donald Trump, I believe, will never experience. He's been in the high command of a winning Republican presidential campaign. So, time to talk a little serious policy and learn more about how trade really works with the best in the business, my friend Bob Zoellick.
It's time to ask some questions and go behind the scenes. Here's our latest interview. We'll try to keep it clean. Radio Free GOP.
We're here with my friend Bob Zoellick. Bob, thank you for doing this. It is an honor to have you here on Radio Free GOP.
Glad to be with you.
You are, my friend, what is often called a serious person, and you've had a lot of serious jobs in policy. But before I get to, we have a lot to talk about in American politics. I ask everybody the same question to start out. How did you get into public service? How did you get into doing what you've done and are doing now?
Well, I came from Illinois, western suburbs, and so just middle-class family. Parents never went to college, but I was born just as the Korean War was ending, and my father was in World War II and then called back for Korea. And so when I was growing up, there was lots of old surplus military equipment around, and that seemed to have generated an interest in military history and then history more generally. And growing up in the Midwest in those years, I kind of wanted to have a sense of the wider world. And so for me, education in schools was the way to kind of live a different life than my parents had. And perhaps somewhat foolishly, I kind of thought, well, even though we had pretty modest living standards, that we were well enough off that I wanted to give something back to the country. So whether it was sort of a sense of patriotism or national service or others, from the early career, I sort of wanted to think and learn how I could do more in the public sector. And so for school, whether it was history or economics or later law or finance or public policy, I was trying to orient myself towards trying to see how I might be able to serve in government. And I did a combined law and public policy degree at Harvard and the Kennedy School, and through there started to meet different people of different political parties to kind of think about how I could learn how to be more effective in government. And through one of those people was a fellow named Dick Darman, who had served in various Republican administrations. And through him, in 1985, I started to work at the Treasury Department with Secretary Baker, who was a great boss, and then got brought into the political world in the 1988 election. So I was brought in the July of 88 when we were about 13 points down to have a sense of what campaign life was like. I was working with the issue and the speechwriters. And so from there, I went on to work with Baker at the State Department. And then after the State Department, we went over briefly to the White House, where we were badly thumped in the 92 election, and I was deputy chief of staff in a losing effort, something, Mike, you're familiar with.
It's always a character building experience. The ugly truth is you learn more on losing campaigns than winning ones. So I always say I'm ready to learn.
Well, yeah, I kind of like the winning ones better.
They're much more fun.
But anyway, and so then I was able to come back to government under President Bush 43 and in working as the U.S. Trade Representative. Then I was asked to become Deputy Secretary of State. So when I was with Baker, I was an undersecretary. So that's the level, kind of the third level. Then I moved to be the number 2 for Condi Rice. And then I went back to the private sector for about a year. And then I was asked to take over the World Bank, which was in the midst of a crisis. So the World Bank is an institution that has about 180 so members countries and is involved with development and growth. And so I then was able to kind of lead the World Bank during the years of the financial and economic crisis. So I've had the good fortune to be kind of involved in public service, but also the private sector over the course of a career.
It's been quite a career, an amazing one. And a question I'd be curious to ask you is, as you look back at some of the government roles you had, which government job was it where you kind of, you were walking home one day and you thought, wow, I now kind of see, I've had enough experience in different pieces, really how the whole thing works, because you've been at those kind of heights. But what do you have a memory of when you thought, aha, some experience or a moment?
It's sort of a cruise over time. And, as I mentioned, given my interest in the public sector, I tried to learn from people early on. I worked for Joe Califano, who had worked for LBJ in a law firm. I'd worked for Judge Wald on the Court of Appeals. I studied cases at the Kennedy School, but where it really came together was when I was working with Secretary Baker at the State Department from 1989-92. That was the end of the Cold War. And he was a tremendous boss because, I was at that time 35, 36 years old, but he didn't really care where you're from, but it was more what you performed and could do. And we had a very effective team. And so I was the lead negotiator for German unification, the 2+4 process. So that was extremely demanding, but extremely rewarding to be kind of the last in the line of people that had served in the Cold War and based on Reagan and Bush to kind of help achieve something that people had wanted to do for 40 years. But then on the other hand, when you get to run your own institutions, as I did when I was trade representative from 2001 to early 2005, and then come back in the World Bank in a crisis, a very big institution, it's fun to run your own institutions too. So I don't know, Mike, I keep trying to learn. This is a year I got a lot to learn.
Yeah, no kidding. It's definitely off the script. I have an extremely fond spot for Secretary Baker myself. Last year, when I was put in charge of the super PAC, I took a look at my schedule and I thought, all right, job one, I want to go see Jim Baker. I had met him and been around some of the earlier Bush media campaigns, so I had a little bit of experience with him, but I reached out to his office and I was incredibly gratified. He said, sure, come on down. So I went down to, get a half an hour tutorial, and he was extremely generous with his time. And I have to admit, he blew me away because he started talking I knew who he was and what he'd done and how sharp he was, but he, still was up to speed on delegate counts, on delegate rules, all the machinery of the nomination. He gave me some very good advice on the Texas primary. He was sharp as a tack. He could have walked that day into running a presidential campaign and been beats ahead of anybody else, I think. A very impressive guy.
It's interesting. Of course, one of the things that where he and I also worked together again, it was our last time, was that in 2000, right, with the disputed election, he and Joe Albo were the first two down, and I came down a little bit later that same evening and kind of organized the whole recount effort, which was it's fascinating in retrospect. It didn't seem so fun at the time because you're really starting from scratch, building an organization. You don't know how long it's going to go. But I think the key is that Baker emphasized that thorough preparation, focus on making sure that you execute, had a real talent for being able to try to bring in people that could complement him. So, when I was with him at the State Department, we had Margaret Tutwiler on the communications side and Dennis Ross and I, and we would add different elements and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. But I think the thing that I found most impressive compared with my other sort of government experiences, he was always there to get something done. The focus was always on results. Amazingly, there's a lot of people who want to be in public service, but then they get there in their office and they kind of wait for the inbox or kind of see what approval they get. And one of the things I learned from Baker is, you keep going until someone says no.
Yeah. Rather to act and worry about permission later and get a lot done. Anyway, he was an incredibly impressive time I got to spend with him. So here we are in a year where I think the slogan might have to be "Crazy times demand a crazy president." And you and I find ourselves both as loyal, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, being publicly unable to support our esteemed nominee, Mr. Trump. You want to talk a little bit about how you came to that decision, and then I'd like to talk about policy with you a little bit.
Sure. Well, I actually first signed a letter in March, and then I recently signed another letter. I'm trying not to do one every week to sort of reduce the value of the franchise here. But to me, it's not a hard decision because obviously I have very different views on policy, on trade and economics and kind of inclusiveness and others. But the more fundamental point, you can adjust somewhat on policy with people and have debates, but there's a fundamental issue of character. And, look, I've been in a number of administrations, actually served in a minor role in the Ford administration and with Reagan and Bush's and others. And I've seen the presidency up close. And Trump is a dangerous man. I would not want that man, with his finger on the triggers. And in part, it's a combination of, his ego, his insensitivity to other people. The United States still is the most powerful country in the world. You have to act with a certain dignity of office, and that's how we actually get other countries to do things with us. And that man has no sense of dignity, and there's a dark side to him too. So and then in addition, what has come out over time is that, look, any president needs help. They need to study. They need to learn things. And that doesn't seem to be kind of his style. He kind of just tries to react with kind of what he sees in the news. And it's all related to his image of how you do real estate negotiations, kind of as a bargain, and kind of all his sense of his own personal brand, and then how he treats aspects of the Constitution, how he treats other people. It just, I would not be comfortable with him serving in that role. And so, I obviously have very different sort of policy views, but the behavior and the character to me are the most grounding issues.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Character is what sets him off for me. And the point you made, I agree with strongly and feel the same way, that he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't know very much, and he seems to have no interest in learning. He seems like just kind of a cul-de-sac of limited thoughts. The NATO thing drove me crazy because, as you say, he treats everything like a real estate deal. It's a parking lot negotiation, and so I'll walk away. Well, you walk away from NATO because the French say no to some insane demand you've made, and the Putins of the world start moving in. They exploit a nanosecond later any weaknesses you make, and he just doesn't seem to understand geopolitical strategy at all and seems arrogant about not wanting to learn about it.
As I mentioned, I worked closely with President Bush 41 with Secretary Baker from 89 to 92. Well, that was a pretty dramatic period in terms of end of the Cold War, events in Asia, with North America, other things, the Gulf War. But one of the things that I watched very closely with President Bush 41 was kind of with the role of the United States, people need to know where the United States stands, even if they're not going to be in complete agreement, because they may be 10 degrees off or 15 degrees off, but we are the pace setter. We're the standard.
Right.
And if you have somebody that basically says, well, I don't care about alliances and maybe, nuclear umbrellas that we've had for 50 years don't matter, or frankly, just attacks Mexicans in a derogatory fashion after our economies are so linked, that would be extremely dangerous for the United States. You just can't act that way, and that's not the way the United States get things done. And, you mentioned real estate background. Look, the United States really shouldn't have the option of just going bankrupt as Trump does if his negotiations don't work out. So it's a real estate background, but it's one where it's all focused on kind of trying to break the other guy. If he ends up sort of losing out, he just walks away and leaves his investors and the people working there in a bad way. But also, fundamentally, his business now is all personal brand. It's not really even a real estate business. And it's all ego and self. And, when you're the president, fine, you're a powerful person, but you're also part of a constitutional system. And you've got to represent a country. You can't just feed your own ego.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think he understands how that machinery works, and he doesn't get that we're the metronome beat, as you say, and when there's no metronome beat, huge systems fall into disorder. He doesn't know that so many countries watch minutely what American presidents do, maybe overinterpreting nuances through the prism of their own politics, which can lead to kind of distorted messages. But you're under that microscope, and you're the linchpin for everything, and when you create vacuums by being Trumpian, the whole thing falls into disorder, and we both know how dangerous that can be for world security. So, but I don't think there's any fixing him. People are saying now, oh, there's a pivot. He's on his fourth set of advisors. I think the problem with Trumpism is Trump, and there's no fixing that.
Well, and also, there was a view, I understand, as some people, Republicans I'd worked with over the years said, well, it was important to have people around him, to advise him. I don't really have a sense that he listens. And frankly, the way he treats people, it seems pretty diminishing and insulting. And, what I've watched leaders, whether it was Baker or Reagan or Bush or others, is that when you're operating at that scale, you're dealing with some people who are accomplished in their own ways. And you got to figure out how are you going to sort of build a team and add. And I don't know, last I saw the Trump campaign, they figuring out how to bring people in who are good at attacking other Republicans. As I said, I've been through a few election campaigns. Normally, at the end of August, you're normally not attacking your own party. It doesn't seem to be the best strategy.
Yeah, he has that predilection. I think he's in a feedback loop where he just watches cable TV all day, sees something that offends him, and then lashes out. In many ways, he's still running in the Republican primary. And you're right about advisors. He reminds me of the old joke about the cannibal king. You send the advisor, and 3 weeks later, you get a bone back with an invitation to send another one. The last guy was delicious. There's just no open channel for anything. Well, look, you are not alone in this. I know there was, as you mentioned, some of these letters. It strikes me that, and I hang around in some of these groups, they let me in for some reason, most of the serious Republican national security people are either publicly not Trump or privately pretty vociferously anti-Trump. I know very few who are publicly quote-unquote for Trump, other than a few elected officials who have primary voter calculations to deal with. I mean, do you know anybody who was particularly serious in that world, in our Republican world over the last 20 years, that's pro-Trump with real credentials, national security? I mean, there's a retired general or two, but nothing, no notables that I know of.
Well, I wouldn't want to besmirch people by associating them with Trump. But
fair enough.
You could joke about it, but it's obviously extremely serious. I mean, people like you, Mike, and, I've tried to do this in other ways. I've tried to build out the Republican Party, try to reach out, whether it's, with Mexican Americans, Hispanics, Asians, others. This is a big setback. And, and frankly, my worry right now is I've been trying to help some of my friends who are internationalists in the Senate to sort of get reelected, and the numbers are weighing them down. Very, very good people who we could lose. This is going to be important for the future of what comes out of this, and how the party is positioned. And when I try to think about sort of advisors, it seems to me that if anything, he's going in the wrong direction with the kind of the people that he's bringing in. And look, on the foreign policy side, there's some frightening things about his attitude towards people that he considers strongmen, whether, Putin in Russia or kind of others. And these are not the things that the United States stands for. And we're already paying a price. There are already countries around the world that say, look, if Trump is a candidate of a major party, can we rely on the United States? And, right. All I can just say, whether working on trade or security or other types of foreign policy issues in all the regions of the world, look, people know the United States now and then will make mistakes or do things differently, but people rely on us, and they look at to the United States at the end of the day to be a solid partner, somebody that they can trust. I mean, I talked about German unification. When the key moment came after 40 years of alliance promises, the United States was the one country that Germany could depend on to sort of stand by the promises of the past. I mean, I don't know what Trump would do. I suppose he'd try to negotiate, something out of it. I don't know. Maybe he could get a new hotel in Berlin or something. But this is serious stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, I would think in the worst case scenario, which I think is unlikely because the math is tough for Trump to actually win. But if it happens and he goes isolationist and has this weird relationship with Putin, if you're the governing authorities in some of these mid to upper level powers that have depended on the defense agreements we have and everything, and you feel alone, you've got to start looking at all new defense policies, including, frankly, even developing your own nuclear deterrent. Because, when you're alone, that's the ultimate insurance card, which throws asunder all the security framework we've built for so long. We've kept that thing bottled up, with nuclear proliferation. But, what do the Poles and the Germans and the Japanese and everybody do if we're no longer the reliable power? It's a terrifying idea.
The larger point there, and this is going to be true whether Hillary Clinton's elected president too, is that since World War II, the United States created this international order that kind of tried to learn the lessons of the Great Depression and the breakdown of security, the rise of Nazis, Imperial Japan, others. And we've had to overhaul it and change it in different ways. But fundamentally, this is the structure the United States started creating in 1945. It's about a 70-year-old system. And you get the feeling in the politics, people are taking it for granted. So what? You can just sort of say to, as you mentioned, Koreans or Japanese and say, maybe we'll withdraw the nuclear deterrent even though, North Korea's got nuclear weapons. That's very scary stuff. But even for Hillary Clinton, the question is going to be, where does the United States go with this system? I worked a lot on the international economic issues. We've seen over the course of a decade that American military power is critical, but it doesn't solve all problems. And so one of the sad things that come out of this campaign is we also seem to be disarming some of our economic tools in diplomacy.
That's a good transition to the other great kind of current horror of the party. Somehow we become a bunch of protectionists. We really are getting the best from Juan Perón. We're going to have authoritarian politics. We're going to have this super leader who's kind of a comic figure. And apparently we're going to tilt into kind of crazy left populism and economics, including something that is historically the opposite of what we're for, which is kooky protectionism. And you've got such a background in trade policy. It must drive you crazy as a career guy who knows all the good people who work in public service in this area to refer to our trade negotiators as a bunch of foolish bumpkins who are tripping around while these savvy Chinese mandarins are, doing circles around us. I know a couple of American trade negotiators and they're sharks. So what's your take on Trump and trade as somebody who really knows how it works? And then maybe we'll get into the bugaboo at TPP and why people on the right and left seem to think it's such a bad thing without really understanding it.
Well, trade is always a tough political issue because, the beneficiaries are widespread, whether it's consumers, whether it's the intermediate goods that, go into other production, and those that have to go through the pain of adjustment or face the competition, they're often local communities. And frankly, the United States needs to do a lot more to help those people adjust in different roles. And there's some interesting ideas out there about how to do it. But Trump has this view that we're losers as a country on trade. And his view is, we need to have a big trade surplus to win. Well, we had a big trade surplus during the Great Depression under Herbert Hoover. We had the Smoot-Hawley bill that raised tariffs. So the goal isn't really just trade surplus or deficit. The goal is, do you have a growing economy? Do you create jobs? Do you have higher wages? And the attack on the trade agreements is particularly frustrating, also ignorant, because, the United States has negotiated free trade agreements with 20 different countries. And if you think about it, U.S. barriers to trade are relatively low. Other countries are usually higher. So if we can have an agreement that brings them down to zero, and we go a little from another level down to zero, we tend to be the beneficiary. And if you look at, that the trade with those 20 countries, they represent about 10% of the world's GDP, but they represent almost half of America's exports. Now, part of that's geographic because with Mexico and Canada. But what's really telling is if you look at these free trade agreements, on the first 5 years after when an agreement goes into effect, the exports to these countries move at 3 times the rate of our usual exports. And, you talk about sort of manufactured goods. We actually have a surplus in the last 5 years of about $230 billion with our free trade partners. On top of that, if you're in the farm community, you're really dependent. About 1 in 3 acres goes to export. And U.S., over the past 10 years, U.S. exports to farm exports have increased to 130%. And frankly, it's also the future. So, we've got services industries that now have about $700 billion of exports, $230 billion of surplus. Well, those terms aren't in sort of the old traditional trade discussions and in the WTO. So those have to be built into these free trade agreements or intellectual property or e-commerce or digital trade or anti-corruption. So the record shows the free trade agreements have been a real benefit for the United States. And here's a guy who wants to kill them all. And, so whether it's in a way, one of the ways we're going to influence the rules of the world in the future, whether it's intellectual property or environment and labor standards or others, is by kind of using our leverage as a big economy to negotiate these agreements. And instead, he wants to take us out of the game, and he doesn't kind of know the facts of what's been done. Now, the other side is trade isn't all exports, it's imports. So one of the institutes here has done a study about what's the benefit for an average family of using 3 members, of lower taxes on what you buy, your goods, your consumption. It's about $10,000 a year. Well, that's not small potatoes if you're worried about kind of working people. And then since about 60% of what we import are intermediate goods, in other words, they then go into other goods, how do you help auto manufacturers in the United States if you force them to pay a higher price for steel? So you can kind of go on and on. His attacks on Mexico are particularly crazy because given the integration of the economy, now of every dollar that Mexico exports, 40 cents represents U.S. product. So, when you look at a lot of these industries, they're very, very interconnected. And the frustrating thing about trade is it's not a zero-sum game. If one guy grows and they buy more, you also grow with it. So, frankly, I think he's got it all turned around. And, his lack of knowledge of how it works and his simple focus on trade surplus and branding everybody as losers plays to people who feel, whether right or wrong, that they were kind of left out. And whether they left out because of technology or competition or trade or others, well, the solution is to help those people adapt to change, not to sell them a bill of goods. And that's what he's trying to do. It's fraud.
The one hopeful sign in all this was he was at the Detroit Economic Club a few weeks ago, and he gave his speech to a very tepid reaction. And you could tell if you watched it that he was a little surprised because he rolled his mercantile stuff in there and his, Hoovernomics, where, we're going to get rid of those damn imports and all that. He doesn't understand. I'm from Detroit, so I grew up around the industry. It's the North American automotive manufacturing complex.
Definitely.
It's highly integrated between Mexico and Canada and the U.S. And there's a ton of massive auto equipment and half-built car trade between Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario, Canada. And the people in that room who live this and are very export. There's a Chrysler World Engine factory that's heavily export-oriented, not far from where he was doing the speech. And you could tell the people who live this in the crowd are like, this guy is still doing the park your import in Japan stuff, from the early 80s. And he just doesn't get it. Trade, I think, more than any other issue, maybe security policy as well, but definitely trade is where the Trump knowledge gap is just a problem. But what I think is, a political analyst he has done is taken the concern people have, particularly in blue-collar America where wages have been stagnant, and he has conflated the economic pain from the change in the massive increases in productivity with anger at trade. That trade metaphor allows him to work the kind of the racial subtext he puts into everything. It's, scheming Chinese, tricky trade negotiators. It's Mexican rapists coming in. Yeah. There's always that ugly racial dimension to what he does. And the real problem we have of trade is just people don't understand how net for a highly productive country like us with a great workforce, it's a winner. And the more we get of it, the better wages will do in almost every sector of the economy.
Well, just to give you an example, manufacturing workers who work in the export trade earn on average 18% higher. It's because they're more competitive. They're part of supply chains than others. They're more productive. They get paid more. But you put your finger on one of the other things that goes back to the character. If you even just watch Trump for a day, there's always somebody to blame. He must have been a terrible kid. I mean, because, it's like anything happens, she's always going to blame somebody else. Okay. And kind of one of the things you try to learn when you get to adulthood is that you got to take responsibility for yourself. And, one of the greatest lies is to sort of say, look, the problem isn't us. It's these guys are doing it to us. These guys are doing it. And it feeds this animosity. But the reason why the United States has been so extraordinarily successful is, after we go through the bitching and complaining part, at some point we say, okay, we got to fix this. I mean, you talked about the auto industry. I mean, I saw what happened in the auto industry in the 70s. And, when, frankly, it wasn't keeping competition. And when it was forced to compete, it got better. And one of the things, too, about trade is, look, most of the polls show is that Americans would be willing to pay a little bit more for American good if they can, but they want choice. And frankly, most Americans probably want to buy the car that they would like as opposed to the one that Trump decides that they're supposed to have. Or, wherever they want to buy their stuff is that they like to be able to, in a sense, get good deals at low prices, whether it's at, Walmart or Amazon or others. And so this is just really backward looking. And the thing I find most frustrating about it is, as you said, Mike, is look, some people have had a hard time adjusting. They didn't get the education. The community gets blown away. We need to help people. And there's ways I think that the U.S. government should do a lot more to help those people. And frankly, not taxing their wages would be one good way. But there's ways you can get them back into jobs and help people. But Trump is in a sense lying to those people. It's a fraud. He's trying to say, look, it's not your fault. It's go blame it on the Mexicans, blame it on these guys, blame it on those guys. And, that's a fool's game. That's a real loser in the end of the day.
And he hurts the people he claims to help. That's the meanest short con in politics. The Democrats do it too when they go all socialist, which is, okay, working poor, we're going to give you people to blame instead of policies that are going to create economic growth to create more demand for labor and drive wages up. up, which is what they really need, and better income distribution. So yeah, no, it is totally a short con. And the way he tried to approach the auto debate at that, or the auto industry at that dinner, gave me a little hope they didn't buy it, but plenty of people did. You know, it's funny. Growing up in Detroit, I'll never forget when I was in high school, which is a long time ago. They took us on a field trip to an auto plant, you know, because we all grew up around the industry. It was the cool thing to do. I remember the incredible contact high I got from all the marijuana smoke at the Clark Street Cadillac. Then, cut to years later, in 2008, depressed after the Obama election, I decided to do a little traveling. I had a script to write for Hollywood, and they've got lawyers, so when they give you the money, you actually have to write the script. So I got on a container ship and took it from Seattle to Shanghai, China, because I'd been to China, but I'd never entered Shanghai by sea. I thought I'd claim it for the British Empire like the old days. So we're going up this, the Yangtze up to get to the port, and I see an amazing amount of industrial capital expenditure. It was right out of Trump comics. There they are. Look at all their building. And Shanghai is an amazingly dynamic city, but I'm at the port, which is a little far away, and I'm a little depressed at all that economic power, thinking, wow, this is pretty impressive and also a little daunting as a competitor. We're going to have our act together here. And I'm stuck in a traffic jam from the port to the city, and I look around, and I started to laugh because every car in the traffic jam was the most popular car in that region of China, the fastest growing auto market in the history of cars. They were, of course, all Buicks.
Yeah,
looking
Buick's
almost
big there.
identical to the American-made Buick. I'm sure they were designed in Warren, Michigan by well-paid engineers. So I thought, for a bunch of knuckleheads who did so badly in the 70s, here we are beating Toyota, beating Volkswagen, beating everybody in an ultra-competitive market with essentially American-designed material, and I felt pretty good about the old hometown. As you say, when Americans get knocked down, we get up again, and we do what Trump seems to think we need, racial slogans to do. We win. So,
well, you also, Mike, one of the reasons why it is frustrating to see him attack these trade agreements is that the U.S. is a cutting-edge economy. And so we're often going to be the leader in sort of new sectors, whether it's e-commerce or internet or digital or so on, whatever it's going to be, or entertainment, your world. And one of the things that is so frustrating is that our trade agreements, because we're a cutting-edge economy, will often set new rules and standards in this to kind of set the rules. And so particularly for the United States, you want to be able to say, look, this is a coming sector. We need to have rules for kind of fair play in these areas, whether intellectual property or service sector, whatever it is. And so it's not only the old world of removing tariffs and quotas, it's biotechnology, it's all the cutting edge stuff. And if you listen to Trump talk about economics, there is no sense of a new economy. There is no sense of kind of where the world is going. And this is one of the maybe the frustrations and limitations about kind of his business experience. Although I've seen you sort of seen some of the stories, look at where Trump Enterprises buys their supplies for his hotels or his goods. They buy abroad. And I presume he'd be happy if some of his TV shows get syndicated abroad. So the reason it's so difficult is that whether it's through ego or a sense of kind of playing on people's fears, it's lying to people and it's a fraud. And, look, people have honestly different views about the difficulty of adjusting or, different tax policies or entitlement policies or other things. People can have legitimate debates about that. But lying to people, and playing off their fears, that's bad stuff.
It's the lowest rung of politics. You can see it, though, because he's one of these guys who's, I've talked to a lot of people who've worked for him in different parts of his empire. Some came out of the woodwork to kind of talk about him. Others we hunted down when we were kind of building our material to duke it out with him. And it's interesting. There are two patterns that emerge. One is he has no interest in details at all. I had a former casino executive come up to me and say, he understands the hotel business because he's basically, as you said earlier, in the licensing business. He'll sell you his name, and then he'll leave town. But when he got into the gaming business, which he was fascinated with the idea of owning one, the gaming business is very complicated. How you actually operate it, it's very competitive with other facilities. And
you're not a counter, are you, Mike?
No. I used to play some blackjack because I was a bit of a math nerd, and that turned into craps. And then I thought, I figured out the numbers here. What I want to do is own the casino, own the gaming operation, at least one with a moat around it. But anyway, the gaming guy told me he had no interest in learning the hard stuff, no interest in going more than a level deep. And what he would do instead is kind of bull rush in and meddle with it and screw it up. And, the book would go upside down for the month because he had kind of thrown a monkey wrench into a finely calibrated operation time and time again. So what other people say is he's the master salesman. He reads a room and then tells it exactly what it wants to hear. And, it's the short con, and here we are in the middle of it. And we see it this week. He's now, from the most nativist guy everywhere who's going to, round everybody up, he's now talking about, I didn't really mean it. I'm going to totally reinvent my position on immigration. And when you change that often, when you pivot every minute of every day, nothing you say can be believed. And I think that's ultimately the thing that'll do him in the election. There's no trust factor there at all. It's so craven.
We're talking about gaming. If you're looking at the odds, I don't think this looks too good for Trump. My real concern is kind of what's left over after the wreckage. And, not only kind of what it does to Republicans in Congress, but also politics is a sport where people learn by imitation. And do they decide to become demagogues and try to play this game again with sort of a different hand of cards? And that's not going to be good for either Republicans or democracy. So I think the real issue here, one of the reasons I've been trying to write some of the things I have on trade and others, is because I think there's going to be a big debate, certainly among Republicans, partly more broadly, about sort of what follows this. And if the idea that comes out of this is, well, we should be more hateful, more spiteful, figure out more groups to alienate, figure out other Republicans to attack and shoot, I don't think that's going to be too good for the future.
No, I agree. That's why I think Republicans have to stop being so timid about Trump. Yes, I get your primary voters may be mad at you, but he has to lose big to purge this out of our party, because otherwise, you're right, the imitation Trumps start appearing. So we have to litigate this, and he has to lose big so we can reclock the party and go beat Hillary Clinton in 4 years and get back. And I think step one of that is to just completely denounce Trumponomics, in addition to obviously his lack of character. Let me ask you one more trade question before we move on to other stuff. The TPP, that has become one of these things that so many people on the Bernie Sanders left and on the Trumpian right instantly oppose. The globalism, the TPP. They've got the slogan down, but I think if you could duct tape them into a chair for a while and give them a real interrogation about it, not that we condone those kind of tactics here on Radio Free GOP, I don't think anybody knows anything about it other than it's complicated and bad and the so-called elites are for it. Can you give us a quick, for a few of our listeners who are confused on this issue and wind up in arguments with their friends, what's the quick guide to what the TPP really is all about and what's in the national interest about it?
Well, the TPP is a modernized open market free trade agreement with 11 other countries. Now, 6 of those we already have free trade agreements with. So you're really adding 5. And of those 5, the big ones are Japan and Vietnam, also Malaysia, Brunei, New Zealand, sort of smaller players. So with the other 6, what you're really doing is you're modernizing the rules. You're trying to sort of create a network of these 12 economies that together, but this includes the United States, which is a big chunk, represent about 40% of the world's GDP. So you're trying to reduce almost all the barriers. But the key point is the one that I alluded to about sort of sectors in the economy, intellectual property, whether it's express delivery, services. You're setting rules. Now, the reason why that's going to be so important is that if TPP goes into effect, you're already getting other countries, Korea, some in Southeast Asia, and others say, whoa, gee, we have to be part of this. So it's kind of, if basically the U.S. rule book gets adopted by more economies, that is going to help kind of U.S. business and industries and help kind of have a fairer, more transparent, anti-corruption. There's labor and environmental standards, fighting fisheries subsidies, lots of good things in this agreement. Now, in addition to the pure economics and trade side, and that's why I was given some of the stuff about the history of other free trade agreements is kind of how they benefited the United States. There is a security component. Now, some people say, oh, yeah, you're always giving away trade for security. The two can actually come together, and they have in the United States history. But The Prime Minister of Singapore was in the United States recently, and he said, look, this is going to be seen as a litmus test about whether the United States understands its own interest in the Asia Pacific. And the Australians made the same point, the Japanese and others. And there's a lot riding on this given the rise of China, because frankly, these countries are going to say, look, it goes back to our concern about Trump, is that if you're not reliable, if you're not steadfast, if your political system doesn't see its own self-interest, well, then can we rely on you on security? Or if you want to come to us about environmental agreements or democracy and others, are you guys going to be in the game? So there's a lot riding on this beyond the trade and economics, but frankly, you can make a darn good case on trade and economics in its own. Now, on top of this, the United States has talked about, well, should we have a similar agreement with Europe, or if Britain leaves, with Britain? We already have a lot of agreements with some of Latin America, but if Brazil and Argentina makes changes. So the real question is the United States going to stall? Is it going to allow the rules of the world economy to be made by others? Or do we want to play the leadership role that we played for the last 70 years? So, look, the U.S. economy has had its difficulties over the past 70 years, but one reason we beat the Soviet Union is because, frankly, we were open, we changed, we were more competitive, we could build a more modernized economy. I'd hate to see the United States retreat.
And particularly, as you say, with the rise of China, which is, a power I believe we can engage with and have a fruitful bilateral relationship. But if they start thinking about their own kind of Chinese Monroe Doctrine in the Pacific, we're going to need strong alliances with the Vietnamese and the Australians, and particularly the Japanese, and having a trade freeze with them is the opposite of what our strategic policy ought to be.
It's not only that, it really goes to this question of whether, look, people in Asia, for them, economics is foreign policy. Economics is the coin of the realm of kind of your power. And if the United States, after all this negotiation, sort of says, oh, well, it really doesn't fit us, and, people can clearly see it's in our self-interest, they're going to say, do those people have the foggiest idea what's going on? Can you rely on them? And frankly, that means that, these countries are going to have to, some of them are smaller countries. China's a big country. Do they make their peace with others? Do they kind of say, well, look, maybe we'll just be a little bit less concerned about U.S. business ties or others. We'll kind of go with the Chinese model, whatever it is. Yeah, that's a big, big, big risk.
There's an old saying in politics that one of the most reliable ways to predict the behavior of kind of smaller politicians is, when in doubt, be for what is going to happen. And it would be a tragedy if the smaller Asian powers decided we were in withdrawal, so be for what's going to happen, because then you know where they're going to realign, which is just not in our interest. What do you think Hillary's going to do? Because she did the world's most awkward flip-flop on the TPP trade deal under pressure from, Bernie Sanders and the kind of loony left in the Democratic Party. So now she keeps saying she's against it. If she's elected president, which is, I think, more likely than Trump, does she flip-flop back? Does she try to amend it to get a fig leaf? Because she knows it's in the national interest. I mean, it's purely left-wing politics that have forced her to do this awkward pirouette on it. What do you think happens when she sits down in the White House and gets the briefing book and everything? Do you have a prediction on what she might do?
Yeah, I think she's dug in pretty deep, and it's not going to be easy to change. Right. And, this is why one of the reasons why the Trump phenomenon is so devastating is, frankly, the Democratic Party had moved protectionist. In 2015, there was a vote in the Congress to grant the authority to do these negotiations, what's called Trade Promotion Authority, the old
Right,
fast
I
track.
remember. Yeah.
And that was passed primarily with Republican votes, and Paul Ryan playing a key leadership role in the House. And so there were only 28 members of the House Democrats who voted for this, and they're a courageous group of people, I have to say, doing that, because they got a lot of attacks from unions or other interests that were more protectionist. So I think what Hillary does is that I think it is very hard for her to flip-flop. Given her reputation, I think that the trade issue kind of moves to the back burner. And then a couple of things could happen. One is what we've talked about in East Asia just becomes more obvious. All of a sudden, people see the U.S. is losing out. All our friends, Australians, Japanese, Koreans, others kind of start to say, gee, are you guys crazy? And all of a sudden we lose out deals. China seems to be more determining the kind of the rules of the future. There's another a way that I've been thinking about, which is that, in trade, you got it's your corollary for going along with otherwise sort of what's going to happen in trade. It's better to be on offense than defense. And so, as opposed to trying to resist people or trying to roll back trade, you have to say, where can you rally people? One possibility is that with Britain leaving the EU, obviously Britain's going to have its own terms with the European Union, and the United States has been trying to negotiate some with the European Union. But I pushed the idea about, hey, well, maybe we should have a free trade agreement with Britain, or maybe we should do it with North America. And because of the feelings towards Britain, you tend to get pretty good support for that. And, certainly on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, it's a little hard to say that the labor rules and environmental conditions in Britain don't meet our standards. So that could be a way where you kind of get the momentum again and then come back to TPP. But I think the reality is it's very hard to see how TPP gets done in the lame duck the few weeks after the election. I think it's hard to see how sort of Clinton sort of does a pivot on the issue, at least for a year or maybe more. And so this year, the politics of trade have ended up being quite devastating. And, the other thing about that's so frustrating is if you look at the general polls, if you look, there was a Wall Street Journal poll that actually had the general support for trade at about 56% versus 38% against. And Gallup a few months earlier was sort of the same numbers. And if you looked at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, for Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic, it's like low 60s for it, high 20s sort of against it. The public isn't against trade. They're worried. They're worried about their wages. They'd like to kind of help American producers. So part of the problem does go back to President Obama. I mean, we talked about North America. He did not have his administration defend NAFTA. And when you've only got one side arguing the debate, it's a little hard to win. And there's a lot of good things that have happened to the U.S. economy and Mexican democracy, and NAFTA is popular in both Canada and Mexico, even though they had the opponents. So part of this, frankly, was President Obama didn't push the trade issue for 4 or 5 years. And then you got TPA through. If he had been a year earlier, I think he would have gotten TPP through. So this is a bipartisan problem that the United States is going to have to face.
No, I agree. He let the arguments get rusty, and in politics, rusty arguments break off and lose. Now, I'll give, as we wrap up the trade discussion, I'll give the Trumpian view a little molecule of free time here. What you always hear, and from the Bernie Sanders world too, is that, quote, we've signed all these bad trade deals. As an expert in the area, in the last 20 years, have we signed any particular, quote, bad trade deals that didn't work out the way we kind of anticipated, something we could learn from? Do they have one they could wave around?
Yeah, there's the biggest one that gets a lot of attention now and getting scholarly work is when China came into the World Trade Organization. You can see the effect. You see a correlation, not necessarily causation, with some of the low-value manufacturing in the United States. Having said that, there could be some other factors. I mean, the U.S. barriers actually were already low prior to China coming into the WTO. I think the bigger issue there was actually the currency value. And this is one of the topics, coming back to your question about Hillary Clinton. If you look back at all the trade charters for GATT and the World Trade Organization, you're not supposed to use currency to manipulate it to take away the trade advantages. And there's something in the articles of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the same way. But it's never been enforced. Figure out how the procedures, how to do it. There's some people who are coming up with some ideas about, look, if a guy intervenes with his currency to keep it down, maybe the U.S. needs counter-intervention. These are things that might come to the fore sort of over the course of the next year or so. And if you could do it in a way that didn't trip up, your ability to conduct monetary policy and didn't sort of create a new license for protectionism, if you did it on the basis of countries that have large surpluses and large reserves and they're intervening in currencies, that could be a vehicle that could actually perhaps allow a Clinton administration to come back. And going back to your point, I do think, on the trade agenda, look, the United States, the key about trade is the United States benefits too from these trade arrangements. But sure, can you always learn about ways to try to make the system fairer? Of course. And particularly for the United States as a cutting-edge economy, in these areas where you need new rules, you need the United States to be working with the business and employee associations and others to figure out how can we make this fair.
I've heard both arguments on the Chinese, currency devaluation thing. One, that they're fairly valuing the currency to what it's really worth. Second, part of their crafty trade negotiation, and they're trying to exploit the system. What's your take on what their currency policy has been?
Well, right now they're actually trying to prop up their currency a little bit. I mean, so, the period that really through maybe from 2001 to 2006 or 7, there you had more of a problem. When Hank Paulson was Secretary of the Treasury, he got them to start to appreciate their currency. So I think today, most fair-minded people would say, look, it's not out of whack. But I think the issue is, how do you make sure you've got rules in place or procedures so that whether it's Japan or China or somebody else, that it doesn't get out of whack? And in a way, it's also like security. You can deter people from doing things if they know that you have a response. So I think the currency and exchange rate issue is a complicated one. Not saying there's an easy solution. I guess what I'm suggesting to you is, in the spirit of, does the system need to continue to take on challenges? I think this is one that there can be some progress. There's some things U.S. can do on its own. And who knows? It might be a way in which TPP could get revived.
Right, that could be the respark if we could get the right deal on currency. So I want to wrap up with a little talk, because we're in the middle now of the real final campaign push here. Conventions are behind us. We're heading toward debates. You've been very involved in preparing people to take office. You were a top advisor to President George W. Bush as he campaigned, and you were head of the foreign policy side of Mitt Romney's transition team.
I was part of debate prep. And
you were?
Yeah. I'm an expert on that.
I didn't know that. What do you think the Trump debate prep would be? I have a picture of Trump sitting in a throne eating meatloaf and kind of grunting at a couple of people barking questions at him. I don't think it'll be a very adult process. And it will be funny if Roger Ailes shows up, because the minute Roger starts barking at him, I think that'll be a show I'd send tickets to.
Well, Roger Ailes is very skilled at this. I watched Roger help President Bush 41. And, Roger has a way to make people relax and laugh, and while focusing on sort of the key issues. This is such an odd one because they're so mismatched. I mean, in that Hillary Clinton kind of is the standard prepare, have the points, make the arguments, and with Trump, you just never know what you're going to get. Part of this depends on your larger campaign strategy if you're Trump. And, obviously he has to decide, does he want to run a campaign that's more inclusive, or does he want to sort of keep narrowing his support base? I mean, if you wanted to have a campaign that was more inclusive, you could use the debates to kind of sort of reset the image. So look, here's a comparison. In 2000, I was quite active with President Bush 43 in the debate preparation. And so one of the things was that, we build up Gore as the master debater. And, part of it was Bush 43, as would freely admit it, didn't always get his sentences connected right, and his lexicon a little off. So we said, look, it'll just be a great success if he can manage to just hold his own. Well, as you recall, Gore, they had 3 different Gores in 3 debates. So what people are partly seeing is the human being, the personality, the style. So does Trump want to go inclusive, or does he want to sort of say, just play to sort of an angry constituency? It's rare that you have somebody kind of get a total breakthrough, but when it does happen, it's a situation like Michael Dukakis in 1988, when asked about his wife being raped, and he kind of showed no sense of humanity, right? Or in sort of Gore's ability when he tried to walk into George W.'s sort of space, and Bush gave him kind of a look back. Those are the things that can be sort of breakers in terms of the style. It goes back to the question we've both been wrestling with. I don't really understand how Trump is going to put together a coalition of states to win. I can get an idea how he can make people angry. I can get an idea how he could sort of build this idea that, the election was stolen, and maybe, fit it into his brand or purchases in the future. But it doesn't look like a winning strategy to me. So that's the hard thing for me to figure out. And for Hillary Clinton, look, you're ahead. What she needs to do is just look calm and cool and professional and competent. And obviously she's got her weaknesses in terms of people's trust level. So the more that she can reassure people, she's learned from her mistakes, that she's, as everybody does, that, she, whether with emails or other things like that there was a mistake and she's learned her lesson, I think that would help her.
Yeah, a little contrition would go a long way for her, but she seems to share the never be contrite, never admit mistake gene with Trump. That's the one eerie thing they have in common. You've prepared presidential candidates to take office. That is a massive operation because when you're sworn in, you take over a big, complicated thing, and I don't think people often know how much work goes into that. We know what will happen with Hillary because they will have the standard procedures. If Trump were to win, as unlikely as I think it is, what would the mechanics be without the normal kind of transition preparation? Governor Christie is doing some things, but it's nowhere near, I believe, at least as of today, not that far from the election, at the scope level that these things have.
Well, transitions vary a lot, and and it depends also in case of Hillary Clinton. She's coming after Obama. How does she want to differentiate herself? Just to what degree did Bush want to be seen as kind of a third term of Reagan? Both presidents want to set their own course, but how do you do that? A lot of transitions are personnel, and it's really the key people that you put in. And I think in the case of Hillary, the key question will be: does she want to try to govern from the center and get some things done, or does she kind of want to run a repeat of Obama ruling by executive order? That's a big question. I mean, I think Tim Kaine signaled sort of one side of her, but her party is not the party that it was under her husband. This isn't the Democratic Party of the 90s. That's one of the reasons, ironically, I think if the Republicans were to hold on to the Senate, it would put pressure on her as well as Republicans to try to get some things done. And that's kind of I think one of the other voices coming out of the public is can Washington work and meet some of the needs of people? I'd have to say today, right now, it doesn't look like the Republicans are going to hold on to the Senate, and then the Republicans hold the House with a smaller majority. Well, then that's a real question of kind of the easiest way to unite is in opposition. And I think that's unfortunate because I'd like to see Republicans stand for things. Paul Ryan, if you're ever going to find a leader who's trying to push ideas, is a person who, is committed, the reason he's in politics and governing. But I think for Hillary, it will be the question of personnel, and does she decide to govern to try to get some things done from the center, whether it's infrastructure or foreign policy, some different changes, sort of other issues. Maybe you could do some with infrastructure and corporate tax reform. Maybe if people are sense of secure the borders with immigration. With Trump, I think Mike Leavitt, who ran Romney's transition, did a superb job. I mean, he was, in terms of trying to identify issues, first 100 days, sequencing, so on and so forth. I don't have any sense that Trump lives in that world. I mean, I think, Trump is kind of does things by seat of the pants, kind of instinct. So this is part of the problem when we talked about people working for Trump. First off, who you're going to get to take, there'll be people, out of ambition or other things that will take the post, but how do they work with this guy? How do they explain some of the things you face in the world and how early steps will be very, very important. These are things that it's just so hard to read from Trump, how he would approach it. And Governor Christie, I don't have a sense that the transition team that he's been able to put together can remotely handle these issues. So, I mean, that's one of the more reasons why this is a frightening process.
Yeah, I think Trump will march in there, start barking orders and demand to see the Roswell aliens at the secret base and then start firing people when they tell him there are none. So let's hope it doesn't happen.
Did you say that there are none, Mike?
Well, Bob, we both went to the secret meeting where we were told to always say swamp gas, remember?
Well, Mike, I can't say any more about this topic.
Yeah, no, exactly. You have a great op-ed on these trade issues. Trump gets it wrong. Trade is a winner for America in the Wall Street Journal. We're going to post that on the radiofreegop.com website. I really want to thank you for doing the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Absolutely. Is there anywhere people want to keep up with what you're doing? Do you have a Twitter feed for the kids or a website, or we should just keep an eye on it?
No, I actually try to stay off some of that. So it's a sad commentary, but, I actually try to preserve much of my time to think or write or sort of read. So I'm afraid you're able to sort of tap into the dinosaur age here. So,
well, I believe in highly experienced dinosaurs who actually know something. We could use a little more of that in our politics. Thanks for being my guest today.
Thanks, Mike.
It's number one for rumors and fun. It's Resistance Podcasting, Radio Free GOP.
Well, that's our talk with Bob Zoellick. I think you can see that we don't exactly have idiots at the top of the American government in Republican administration. We have smart guys who know the world. In fact, only in the Trump universe, the bizarro land of the Orange Menace, is it a crime to be really, really smart. Now, if you're interested in some of the op-eds that Bob spoke about that he's written on trade lately, there are 4 of them, and we've posted them all on our website, radiofreegop.com. You can go there, check them out yourself, and learn a lot about how trade policy really works. And so, until next week, there they are. They are relentless. It is the orthodoxy police, moving slower than ever, but still trying to hunt us down here in the Republican resistance. We need to move to a new undisclosed location. Until then, follow us on Twitter at Radio Free GOP, or follow me at Murphy Mike. Again, our website, radiofreegop.com. And you can always send us your comments or suggestions at comment@radiofreegop.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week, remember, always, victory will be ours. Thank you.
Radio Free GOP, the resistance sound all campaign long.
This has been Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance, with your host, Mike Murphy.